If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. So Chris, when did you first become interested in aviation?
Well, as a young lad, I made model aircraft, as a lot of people did. And then, as I didn't make them very well, to be honest, but as life went on, I then realised that aviation fascinated me. And I seriously started thinking about a career in aviation, probably when I was about 13, 14 years old. When I was at school, I joined the Combined Cadet Force in the RAF section, and that led me on to getting a gliding course through the RAF, and then a flying scholarship and selection for the Royal Air Force, which I joined in 1969. So I did my flying scholarship on the Chipmunk up at Perth, Scone Airfield, in 1969, summer of 1969, just before I went to Cranwell. So I did 30 hours on the Chipmunk up there, which was a great experience. And I then ultimately got my private pilot's license, doing the extra flying required on a Beagle Pup 150 and Cessna 150 out of Leeds Bradford Airport. And in late September 1969, I joined RAF College Cranwell as a cadet for a 2.5-year cadetship, leading to commissioning as a pilot officer and the award of wings on the completion of basic flying training on the Jet Provost.
What was that like to fly, actually?
The Jet Provost?
Yeah.
It was, well, looking back on it, it was a very straightforward machine. At the time, of course, it was all jet and, you know, very new and exciting. In some ways, interestingly enough, it was a darn sight easier to fly than the Chipmunk. Of course, the Chipmunk had some very interesting directional issues on takeoff and landing, which you really had to be on top of. And the Jet Provost, with its tricycle undercarriage, didn't have those problems. The difference was the tail wheel configuration of the Chipmunk and the slipstream from the propeller and all those sort of things, and gyroscopic forces. Whereas the Jet Provost just didn't have those problems. It had tricycle undercarriage, single jet engine, which didn't give you any gyroscopic problems or anything like that. So the JP was actually a very nice, docile aircraft to fly and a very good basic trainer. So at Cranwell, in our last year there, we did about 165 hours on the Jet Provost, and that culminated with the award of wings and commissioning as pilot officers at the end of the course there. So that was a great experience and a great achievement, but of course that was only the beginning of a further stage of training and ultimately into a career in the Royal Air Force.
So when you were going through your training, did you have a frontline type you wanted to go on to?
Interestingly, no. I knew I wanted to go into fighters. That was the first thing. I really didn't want to go and fly transport or helicopters. I mean, they all have their attractions, but to be honest, fighter stream was where I was pointed. And as I went through my training, I actually had harboured this idea about becoming a flying instructor, so that when I did my advanced flying training on the NAT at RAF Valley, I considered that very seriously and discussed it with my instructor. And ultimately, when I completed the course at Valley, I was lucky enough to get taken off to be a flying instructor. It was a privileged position to be in. Usually, the top 1 or perhaps 2 people from each course would go off to be flying instructors.
It's a creamy affair.
A creamy, yes, that's what they're called. Yes, yes. A bit of a derogatory expression quite often. But it was usually the guys from the top end of the course that were taken off to do it. So it was an accolade to get that posting. But in all honesty, I wasn't top of the course. The 2 guys who were top of my course both finished up on Harriers. Well, they were both posted to Harriers. One of them didn't get there for various reasons. But the other guy, a very good friend of mine, Paul Hopkins, he went straight through to Harriers. And I was 3rd on the course, and I got a posting to RAF Little Rizzington to train as a flying instructor, which was a 6-month course down in the Cotswolds, ultimately qualifying as a qualified flying instructor of QFI, back on the Jet Provost. which after the nap was a bit of a step down.
I can imagine.
Doing everything about 100, 150 to 200 knots slower, you know. But it was an interesting, challenging job to get. And as I say, I was straight through training, so I was about 21 years old when I was doing the course. I was still 21 when I arrived at RAF Linton-on-Ouse as a flying instructor. And I did 2.5 years instructing on the Harrier. So I was fortunate enough to start off with a brand new course. So my very first trip was a familiarisation ride with one of the students. And that course I saw all the way through. I then saw another course all the way through. So after 2 years, I was then taken off to join Standard Squadron, which was responsible for checking the standards of the other instructors and helping them to upgrade their instructional category. So I did my last 6 months in that. So I didn't fly that much with students. I spent most of my time, the last 6 months, flying with other instructors, which was, again, a privileged position to be in, and very interesting as well, because you're flying with people from lots of different backgrounds who have a lot more experience than you do as a pilot, but not necessarily as experienced as an instructor. So that was good fun, and as I say, very interesting. And I was fortunate enough at the end of my 2.5 years at Linton-on-Ouse to get a posting to the Harrier.
So Chris, what were your first thoughts on the Harrier?
Well, the first time I flew the Harrier, I was about halfway through my course at my tour at Linton-on-Ouse, because I knew a number of people that were flying the Harrier by then, especially my good friend Paul Hopkins. So I went off down to Wittering on a visit there, and I was very fortunate to fly with a guy who I knew previously. I'd known him up at Leeds Airport at the Flying Club there, a guy called Dudley Carvell, who's a very famous pilot. He was a Red Arrow display pilot. And I flew with him in the Harrier, with the T4, on one squadron at Wittering, and to be honest, I was gobsmacked. The acceleration of the aircraft. Well, let's start with when you start the engine up. There is an amazing feeling of power from that aircraft. The whole airframe vibrates and rumbles, so you know it's not a Jet Provost, it's not a Gnat. This is a serious machine. So that was probably the first impression. And then when you get on the runway and you go to take off in the aircraft, the acceleration was phenomenal. Had full fuel on board, as I remember, almost certainly. Probably didn't have too many weapons or anything like that on board. But even so, even when you got a reasonable load on, you still had good acceleration. But in the normal training fit, the aircraft was very, very fast off the end of the runway. So that was the first impression. And then it was just, you know, the sheer speed and the power of the machine. The maneuverability was good. And then obviously we came back and did some hovering and things like that, and that was great fun. But unfortunately, of course, because I then hovered, I had to drink the hover pot in the bar that night, which was 2 pints of beer down in one. So that was the first time I had to drink the hover pot, even though I hadn't actually converted onto the aircraft at that point. But that was my first impression of the aircraft. It was an amazing machine, and I suppose as I walked away from the aircraft, I thought, well, flying one of those is going to be a real challenge.
Absolutely, yeah. So what was this the GR1 in service at the time?
This was the GR3 by then.
GR3.
The GR3 had come into service with the T4, so the first aircraft I flew in was the T4, yes.
So, yeah, can you tell us what the aircraft, the GR3, was designed for in the RAF?
Yes, it was essentially a short-range, close support aircraft to support the Army in the forward edge of the battle area. So that was the main role of the aircraft. It also had a reconnaissance capability. It had an F-95 camera built into the nose of the aircraft, which faced out to the left, so that you had the ability to go and recce targets either before attack or post attack to see what the damage was, but also obviously the main role was to deliver weaponry, probably against Warsaw Pact armoured hordes would be the envisaged type of target that we'd be up against.
So can you talk us through some of your ground training on the Harrier?
Yeah. interestingly enough, despite the complexity and the fact that it's a frontline aircraft type, as I recall, the initial ground school was not much more than a week on the aircraft, and that was just going through the basic systems of the aircraft. So you had to learn all about the hydraulics, the electrics and all that sort of thing. About a week in the classroom. Second week was taken up with doing some simulator training. But before we actually started on the aircraft, we had to do various things like go to aviation medicine training at North Luffenham to get all the right kit and to do a decompression run. I can't remember what we did, probably an explosive run from 25,000 feet up to 40,000 feet and something like that. So that was fairly bread and butter. When you went on a new aircraft type, you went to RAF Luffenham to do that training and get all the kit that you needed for the aircraft. More particularly for the Harrier, we had to do a helicopter training course before we started flying the aircraft. So in those days, we went to RAF Turnhill and flew in the Whirlwind. And that was a great experience because we didn't have to know anything about the aircraft. We didn't have to know how to operate it, how to use the radio, how air traffic worked around there or anything. All we had to do was climb in the aircraft and fly the aircraft. So that was great fun. So I had 5 trips, I think, in the Whirlwind during that week, as we all did. I had a trip in the Gazelle as well, which was just for interest at the end of the week. But that was great, just to get you in the idea of hovering an aircraft, slowing down to the hover and then accelerating away from the hover. And by the end of that week, we were doing all sorts of amazing things like landing into clearings in woods and things like that. So, and it was the sort of thing that if you did helicopter training properly, you would only do right at the end of the course. But they rush us through and give us really challenging things to do. And the instructors, I think, enjoyed it as well.
What a treat.
So we did that sort of what we call lead-in training to Harrier. We did 2 weeks in ground school and simulator, and then we started flying the aircraft, and that was it. So it was quite a quick baptism of fire. So sort of week 3, you were into flying the aircraft and going out for your first trip. The training on the Harrier was pretty darn rapid, actually. They devolved a course over a number of years, which comprised 21 sorties, which was your initial training on the aircraft. So the dual sorties, you had 2 dual sorties and that was it. And the amazing thing, and I went back and instructed later on, which I'm sure we'll come to, but when you flew the aircraft for the first time, you sort of approached it with the idea that the instructor was going to demonstrate a lot to you. It didn't happen like that at all. You started the aircraft up, which was took a bit of time because it was all fairly fresh, even though you'd been on the simulator, but you got the aircraft going, you taxied it out, you got to the end of the runway. The instructor in the back seat then did an acceleration run down the runway up to 100 knots. That's just to look at the acceleration, and secondly to look at how we stopped the aircraft, because the brakes on the Harrier were not particularly good. So the way that you slowed down if you landed with like 100 knots is that you'd slam the throttle closed, you'd rotate the nozzles so you got some forward nozzle thrust, and then you'd increase the power again up to about 60% to help slow the aircraft down. And then when you got down to about 60 knots, you'd then start using the toe brakes. So you do an acceleration run demonstrated by the instructor in the back, you go down to the end of the runway, turn round, and then you do the same thing coming back up the runway.
Did a lot of pressure there.
Oh yes, yeah, very exciting, you know. And you're thinking really hard what you're doing with your left hand, because for the first time in your life, you've got 2 levers to play with. You've got the throttle and you've got a nozzle lever, and you've got to make sure you've got the hand on the right lever at the right time. So you did the acceleration back down the runway, you then turned around, and the next time you took off. And I say you took off, as a student, you took the aircraft off on conventional takeoff. So you went off down the runway to about 140 knots, pulled back on the stick, got airborne at about 160 knots, and you're away and climbing very rapidly. And so that sortie all flash past in a blur. You know, you climbed very quickly up to about 10,000 feet, did a few loops, you know, just got the feel of the aircraft. And then you came back into the circuit. Oh, you looked at stalling, you looked at slowing right down to the stall as well, a few things like that. Just got the feel for the aircraft. And then you came back into the circuit. The instructor would demonstrate a circuit and a landing, and then it was all yours, and you just had to carry on doing circuits and landings till you ran out of fuel. Or, I say, get down to very low fuel states when the instructor would probably demonstrate a hover to you and a vertical landing, and that was the end of the trip. The second trip would be very much the same, perhaps with a little bit more vertical work at the end of it. And your third trip, you were on your own in a single-seater.
Wow, that's really throwing you in the deep end, isn't it? What was it like to hover on your first attempt, and is it difficult to mast in there, especially the GR3?
Right. Well, yes, you obviously think hovering is going to be hugely difficult. It's not, actually. The big thing is to have the confidence that you can do it, because it's quite daunting when you think that you're sitting on a column of thrust. You've got to keep the aircraft under control if you're going to carry out a safe vertical landing. So it's a lot of psychological pressure. Having said that, having been demonstrated a hover at some point, either on trip 1 or trip 2, you would probably have had a quick go with the instructor as well, so you would have done some hovering. And then your fourth trip on the aircraft would be a dual again, which would just be 3 hovers. So you'd taxi out, you'd do a vertical takeoff, hover and land, you'd do it again and do it again. So you do 3 what we call press ups, straight up, straight down, bit of time in the hover, and then taxi back in out of fuel, and having got rid of a lot of adrenaline as well. So if that went all right, you were then trip 5 on your own, out there in a single seater. And the way it was done was that one of the instructors would go out and he'd be in a caravan type setup on the north side of the airfield, where we had a big concrete landing pad where you could do vertical work. And you'd sit on a discrete frequency with him, and then you'd be able to talk to him, or more importantly, he'd be able to talk to you if things started going wrong and tell you what to do. It was more psychological pressure than anything else. Providing you put all the levers in the right place at the right time, everything went fine.
That's and then
it's a big if, yes, and it didn't always happen quite right. And then it was really down to having the confidence to make fairly large control inputs, both on takeoff and in landing vertically, because the aircraft would have a mind of its own. For instance, on the vertical takeoff, the trim position of the stick was that the aircraft would actually take off with a nod, so it would take off and the nose would go down, so you had to be quite quick to correct that. And there was a very good reason for that, and that was to make sure the front puffer was closed, so that as the engine spooled up to full power, you didn't start ingesting a lot of hot air, which could finish up with the aircraft limiting the power available, because the engine had self-protection devices driven by temperature. So you had to leave the stick in the trim position, select full power, wait for the aircraft to start lifting off. As it started lifting off and you felt the nod starting, you'd then start pulling gently back on the stick. But while this was going on, the aircraft could be a little bit unstable in roll perhaps, or a little bit more in pitch, so you had to make, if necessary, fairly large control inputs to control it. And as I say, the same would apply when you're landing vertically, because coming down vertically, everything's fine till you get down to about the last 20 feet or so, when you might start, well, you would start getting quite a lot of reflected jet thrust off the ground, coming up and hitting the aircraft. And the aircraft would shake around quite a bit, and you just had to have that confidence to control the aircraft and keep the aircraft coming down. And then as soon as the wheels touched the runway or the landing pad, slam the throttle closed.
Yeah, that's brilliant noise.
Yes, because if you didn't, the aircraft would bounce back up in the air again.
Wow, that's incredible. And I want to talk about DACT. It's one of our favourite subjects on the channel for our viewers as well. Did you ever get to fly DACT?
Oh yeah, GR3? Oh, quite a lot, yes. Yeah, but that was something you wouldn't do till you were on the squadron, of course. So this is some way downstream.
Oh, so not in training, you wouldn't?
Not on the conversion unit. We would do combat on the conversion unit. So we do Harrier v Harrier combat, which would be basically learning basic combat manoeuvres. So we do quite a lot of that. But DACT, yes, once you got to the squadron, we'd do DACT against all sorts of aircraft. So we'd do it against our own aircraft, particularly the Phantom and the Lightning. At the time I was flying the GR3 initially. But then, you know, we'd fly against the Americans, F-16s, F-15s, whatever happened to be around. So Mirages for the French, you know, whatever happens to be out and about there. We had systems set up within NATO so that we could do training with our NATO allies.
Not bad, not bad. But let's talk about the cockpit, because I've sat in a GR3 and it seems tiny. How did it feel as you as a pilot, you know, flying about in that thing?
Tiny. Yes, it did feel small. I'm not a big guy, and there were certainly guys bigger than me flying the aircraft. One in particular, Bob Ison, who ejected in the Falkland Islands. He was a big guy, and we were all quite surprised that the Martin Baker seat coped with him when he finished up ejecting in the Falklands. But that's another story, which is not one of mine. The aircraft was very small. You know, once you were sat in it, you hardly had room to move your elbows out. Later on, I flew across the Atlantic in a Harrier GR3, and with all your kit on and all your maps and bits of paraphernalia that you had to take with you, there wasn't much room left in the cockpit. You had to take your lunch with you and some drink and things like that. So it was very tiny. It was, yeah, I mean, a lot of those aircraft, in all honesty, were ergonomic slums, to be honest. Yes.
They
weren't particularly well designed. The Harrier GR3, for instance, was developed from the Kestrel, and it had a very basic head-down instrument fit. It had a head-up display as well, but neither was really primary, so you had to basically keep an eye on both the head-up display and the head-down display as well. So you asked about the cockpit, the head-down instruments were all tucked away under the left-hand coaming, so there was just a little cluster of instruments down there. So if you were flying on the head-down instruments, you were just peering under the coaming basically and flying the aircraft that way. And it was not a great display, and in all honesty, a number of people did have trouble learning to fly the aircraft on instruments and gaining their instrument rating.
So what was your first squadron, and how did it feel being combat ready, as it were, for the first time?
Well, my first squadron was one squadron down at Wittering. When I graduated, I was just moved down the airfield by a couple or 300 yards down to one squadron, which was nice because it was a great outfit, you know, very historic squadron. Progressing through to combat ready, it didn't seem, in all honesty, it didn't seem like a huge milestone. By then, I'd been in the Royal Air Force for a number of times. I'd been a productive pilot as a flying instructor, so it's just a natural progression to work through the training on the squadron to get up to combat ready status. So it didn't make a huge amount of difference. Yes, I mean, if the balloon had gone up for whatever reason, if I wasn't combat ready, I'd probably been made combat ready very quickly at that point anyway. But once we'd done the mandatory training, particularly on one squadron, for instance, we had the air-to-air refueling role, whereas the Germany squadrons didn't. So we had to learn that. But that was only a matter of doing 2 or 3 sorties with the tanker to get qualified for that. And otherwise, it was just proving your competence at flying around and leading at least a pair of aircraft, your ability to do combat and all that sort of thing, all the basic skills that we had to demonstrate. But once you met all that, there was a training syllabus that we had to work through, which would normally take about 4 to 6 months to get through, and then you were declared combat ready.
That must have been incredible.
Yeah.
So I want to talk about, we've had many Harrier pilots on, but we've never talked about Belize. So can you tell us about your time here and what the conflict was actually about and why the Harriers were needed?
Well, the Guatemalans had a land claim to the southern part of Belize, and they really wanted access to the Caribbean waters because they had a seaboard in the Pacific, but they actually wanted access through into the Caribbean as well. So they had a land claim, and at that point, in fact, it had occurred a couple of years previous to the reinforcement I was involved in. They'd been chuntering about doing something about this, and militarily. So the response of the UK government was to reinforce Belize. So when I went out in 1977, it was the second time it had happened. And quite amusingly, just a little anecdote from the first time they went, before I joined the squadron, I wasn't even on Harriers at the time. The first time they went, the squadron executives, the boss called his flight commanders and the senior engineering officers together and said, right, I've just had a call and we've got to prepare to go out to Belize. And they went, okay, boss, you know, I sat there and they're sort of talking around it. And eventually one of the flight commanders and said, okay, I give up, where's Belize? To which point the boss said, I don't know, where's the squadron navigation officer? Let's get him. So it may be a bit of an apocryphal story, but I quite like it and it may have a grain of truth in it. But anyway, for those that don't know, Belize is in Central America. just south of Mexico on the eastern side of Central America. So this was one of the periods in 1977 where the Guatemalans were threatening to do an invasion to try and grab the land to the south of Belize, on the south side of Belize. So the decision was taken that there would be another reinforcement, and part of that reinforcement would be 6 aircraft from No. 1 Squadron at Wittering. So I was detailed off to fly one of those aircraft. We talk about the role of the aircraft. Of course, the role of the GR3 we've talked about previously, but interestingly enough, of course, when we went out to Belize, the initial thought was that we were going there in the air defence role, because they had A-38s, yes, which would probably support any operations on land. So we were there to sort that out in the air defence role. Well, of course, the Harrier GR3 was not equipped with a Sidewinder. It had a gun, and that was it. Not only that, but we didn't know what the computation on the gun sight was. But we did know that the bullets weren't going anywhere near the computed gun sight. So we very quickly acquired one of the weapons instructors from Coningsby off the Phantom, who came across to work with our qualified weapons instructor to try and find out where the bullets were going. So we spent a whole week working on that. It took us 2.5 days before we got a single bullet on the flag, wow, which was the target that was towed around for us by Canberra. But we eventually found out that the bullets were going somewhere around there, so we spent the rest of the week trying to prove that. But in all honesty, I don't think we got very far with it. So if we had finished up trying to shoot A-38s down in Belize, it would have been a matter of getting up pretty close to them and just hoping that you could get some bullets on them.
Interesting. So how many crews were actually designated down there, and even ground crew as well?
Yeah. Well, we finished up with we set up with 6 aircraft out there, and I think we took all the squadron pilots out there initially, but then once it had all settled down, we had 6 aircraft and 7 pilots out there at any one time. And then later on, the whole detachment went on for many years, in all honesty, but they ran down to 4 aircraft with 4 or 5 pilots there at any one time as well.
And could you talk us through any missions you carried out, and was it on a daily basis when you were doing these?
We'd fly every day out there. After the reinforcement, we had a fairly exciting time when we first arrived. I remember I'd flown the last aircraft in there. There's a bit of a story behind that, but you'll have to buy the book if you want to find out about it. I flew the last aircraft in there, and when I landed I was quite tired. I'd flown across the Atlantic to Goose Bay the day before, then we'd flown down the eastern seaboard of the United States and across the Caribbean the next day, all in one flight to Newfoundland, another flight to Belize, all refueled off Victor tankers. So they're long sorties, quite tiring. By the time I arrived there, I was pretty knackered, but they decided who was on standby for the next morning, because we were actually going to put aircraft up first thing in the morning, because obviously dawn and dusk is the typical time to try and hit at people if you want to. So there was a concern that the Guatemalans might try and do something first thing the next day. So I went to bed completely knackered. I was sharing a room with an army captain, and in the middle of the night, I remember this guy came crashing into our room, said, "Is Captain so-and-so here?" And this guy went, "Yeah, that's me." And said, "We come on to Guatemalans are going to invade," So I thought, oh, gosh. And then I thought, well, actually all the crews have been nominated for first thing in the morning. So I just rolled over and went back to sleep again. And I thought, well, somebody will wake me up if they need me. Yeah. So after the first week or so, everything started winding down, and we went on to a more routine footing. Up till then, we'd done dawn and dusk patrols, just putting caps up, combat air patrols, just in case anything did happen, every morning and every night. Nothing did happen. After a week, we just wound the whole thing down. We stayed on standby as necessary, so we could have reacted very quickly, but we just slipped into routine training. So the flying that we were doing out there, we weren't doing any specific operations as such. It was just doing our normal bread and butter training to maintain our skills. So we're doing simulated attack profiles on ground targets. We're doing quite a lot of work with forward air controllers, so Army guys or Air Force guys who were qualified to give us forward air control on the radio to talk us into targets. We do air combat as well, And we do quite a lot of live weaponry as well, because we had a range out there, so we could go and strafe, we could fire rockets, we could drop bombs and all that sort of thing as well. And very occasionally, the Royal Navy would pitch up, because they had an aircraft, not an aircraft carrier, they had a ship that was always out in the Caribbean. I think they called it the West Indies gunship. It very rarely came to Belize, because they're much more attractive places to go for the Navy than Belize, but occasionally they were either told to come or they took pity on us and they'd pitch up, and they might host a cocktail party. But more importantly, they'd tow a target for us. So it was what was called a splash target. So they drive along at 15, 20 knots or whatever and tow this target behind them, which made a splash in the water, a big plume of water. So you actually had not only a target to move at, but a moving target. So it was quite useful, because it was like going against a tank that was on the move in the central region of Germany. So it was a very good way of training against a moving target. So again, we could use practice bombs on those and strafe and so on. So good training.
Absolutely. Is there any memorable stories that stick out in your mind, maybe you can share with our viewers from your time based there?
A clean one.
Let's go clean, because I'll get demonetised if it's naughty.
There's a number of things that I covered in the book. I think one of the slightly alarming ones, which still sticks in my mind, is taking off one day. And one of the last checks we had to do, we would always taxi out in Belize with the canopy open. It was very hot and humid out there, so we'd always taxi with the canopy open. And the last thing we did before we did the engine checks before takeoff would be to close the canopy. Now, the canopy on the Harrier GR3 was purely mechanical. You'd get hold of it, you'd slide it forward, and then there was a locking indicator down on the left-hand side. So you'd close it, you'd check that the locking indicator was in the right place, good to go, you do your engine checks and get airborne. So I did all that as normal, went off down the runway, got to my pre-designated speed to put the nozzles down, which I duly did. The aircraft leapt up into the air, and as it leapt up into the air, the canopy just flew backwards and stopped. Didn't come off the aircraft, it just slid straight back on its rails and stopped. And there was nothing I could do in terms of, I could not abandon the takeoff at this point, because I was airborne with not a lot of runway ahead of me. And so I was committed to accelerating away and getting around the circuit. And the problem I then had was that if anything else happened to the aircraft, I did not have the option to eject, because if you ejected from the Harrier GR3, the way for the ejection seat to leave the aircraft was through the canopy, so that you had a miniature detonating cord that was built into the canopy. That would fire off, shattering the canopy, and then the seat would go up vertically through the shattered canopy. If the canopy was open, the position it was in with me, if I'd ejected, the seat would have gone straight into the canopy rail, which was right where the ejection seat is. So at that point I thought, I've got to get the aircraft back on the ground pretty darn quickly. Now, the chances of anything catastrophic happening were fairly low anyway, but of course it's quite mind-focusing in an aircraft like that. You haven't got a way out if anything does happen. So at that point, you just hit the fuel dump switches, get rid of the fuel that you need to get down to landing weight, quickly around the circuit, and within about 3 minutes you're back on the ground again. That was that. So
that is really scary. But yeah, you obviously trained for this. But yeah, talking about ejections, to finish up this part on the GR3, you actually had an ejection in the GR3, didn't you? Can you tell us about this?
Yes, I did. This happened some years later when I was an instructor on the conversion unit at Wittering. And I was loaned out to No. 3 Squadron out in Germany for one of their tactical evaluation exercises, which were carried out by NATO. So I was fortunate enough to be allocated to the same field site as my good friend Paul Hopkins, who was based out in Germany at that time. So I was living on the field site with him. We had a nice night out in the pub the night before. The next day I was in the cockpit, and we were actually, we were actually on evaluation exercise then. It was a Monday morning, I suppose, I'm not really sure. But anyway, I was flying with a very good friend of mine, Les Evans, and we were paired up for the morning, and he was in one aircraft, I was in the other. And I was leading the pair of aircraft, which I remember as being a little bit strange, because Les was based out there and knew his way around Germany pretty well, whereas I was just on loan from the UK, had never done a tour in Germany and didn't know my way around all that well. And the Harrier GR3 the inertial navigation system was not that reliable. So I was feeling a little bit of pressure, and especially since the visibility was very poor that day. But we'd done a couple of trips, everything had gone fine, and we were sitting there waiting for another target to come in, and there was a long delay, and it was October. It was actually a lovely day. The sun was shining, it was quite warm. And when we were waiting to be tasked, if there's nothing coming in, we'd be put on a separate landline so we could just talk between the two of us to keep ourselves entertained. So we were sitting on this landline, just bantering away, having a laugh, you see, and meanwhile our ground crew had refueled the aircraft, we were ready to go again, we were just waiting for a task, and then eventually the task came through, we were taken onto another landline, briefed up by the Army Major as to what we had to do, and eventually we dispatched ourselves. And you're always on a fairly tight timeline for these because you had a time on target to make. So as soon as you knew you got your task, you're looking at your watch saying, right, we've got to be airborne in about 6 minutes from now. You know, so you have a quick chat about the routing and everything, and then you start the engine and off you go. So we taxied out, got airborne in good shape. I went off first. Les joined me, and we went out into the designated area. We spoke to our forward air controller out there about our target, and we were just positioning for the target run when I felt, I was in a turn at the time, and I didn't see anything, but I felt a couple of thumps through the airframe, quite pronounced thumps. And if you had a bird strike, you didn't necessarily feel it. And I thought, well, that's not a bird strike. I thought, well, that's not right at all. And there's just a doom from behind me, which is where the engine is. I thought, not happy about that at all. So I just rolled out of the turn, pulled up to about 1,500 feet, and said to Les, best you come and have a look at my aircraft because I'm not sure everything's all right. So I'm sitting there looking at all the engine instruments, the warning panel, which should be telling me if anything's wrong, look at the hydraulic systems, absolutely nothing, everything's fine. I'm thinking, oh. Les comes along, has a look around the aircraft, so he's in close formation, just flying underneath me and having a good look round. And ironically enough, at the point that he said, looks all right to me, that was the point at which the engine stopped.
Oh.
So at that point, I pulled up because the first thing you do is convert excess speed to height. So I pulled up, and that's the last time Les saw me because he disappeared out in front of me, and I said the visibility was not good that day. So he never saw me again after that. So I pulled up. I probably didn't get much more than another 400 or 500 feet, and then I was at 2,000 feet, bunting over to get into a glide, and sorting out relighting the engine because the engine was just not developing any thrust. So first thing is that the aircraft gliding speed was 250 knots. Now Harrier is a heavy aircraft, it's got a very small wing. When you're gliding at 250 knots, you're coming down very steeply. So all I'm looking at is a lot of German countryside coming up to meet me very quickly, which is quite mind-focusing. So anyway, the relight drill for the Harrier engine was very straightforward. We practiced it in the simulator a lot, so I had no qualms about what I needed to do. So I shut the engine down fully, did a relight, the aircraft relit, but as soon as I started advancing the throttle, absolutely nothing happened. It just started rumbling, and you could hear horrible noises coming from the back, and I thought, no, I'm not getting any thrust out of this thing. So I shut it down again and thought, I've got time to give it another go, gave it another go. Absolutely same response, the engine relit but wouldn't produce any thrust. So at that point I thought, right, I'm out of here. So I shut the engine down, just called ejecting, pulled the handle in, I was out of there, and that was that.
What was it like actually ejecting? Do you remember any of it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was interesting because I remember my very last thought, having transmitted ejecting, I remember sitting there just reaching down for the handle thinking, I hope this works because if it doesn't, it's not going to be very nice.
Any injuries?
Yeah. Just to go back to what was it like, it's very violent, to be honest. Even, that's a rocket seat, that was a Mark 9 seat. Mm-hmm. So the initial boot up the backside that pushes the aircraft out of the seat out of the aircraft is a cartridge, that, like a shotgun cartridge that fires you off. But it then trips a lanyard, which fires a rocket pack. So the rocket pack is what really accelerates you away and upwards. So even allowing for the fact that that's comparatively a fairly gentle acceleration compared with the early ejection seats, which just relied on a very hard bang up the backside. It's still pretty violent, so it's very rapid acceleration, which you certainly know about. And then before you know it, the seat's dropping away from you, your parachute's deployed, and you're there going, oh, here I am, everything's all right. So anyway, a short time later I'm coming down, and yes, to answer your question, I managed to damage my ankle on landing.
Oh.
I had a bit of a sideways drift on, and I sprained my ankle very badly. I thought it was broken, it hurt so much, but in fact it was just badly sprained. Oh. So I was hopping around afterwards, and all these German people appeared from nowhere. I was out in the middle of the countryside, but within no time at all, there was about 20 Germans around me, looking very concerned. I'm thinking, why are they so concerned? I'm up, maybe hobbling around a bit. But in fact, what had happened was I got quite a few cuts in my face here from the detonating cord and the canopy, which had actually cut into my cheek here, and I had blood all down here, and I didn't realise it at the time, but I was covered in blood. So that's why the Germans were a bit concerned for me, but I was all right. And I was only on the ground there for a matter of, it seemed like a very short time, no more than 10 minutes, probably less, when one of our helicopters pitched up from the main base at Gütersloh, flown by a guy who used to be a flying instructor at Linton News with me, and John Day, who went on to become Commander-in-Chief at Strike Command, but he pitched up in his helicopter, whisked me away and delivered me to Gütersloh, and they went right off to hospital and get your leg put in plaster. And that was that.
What a story.
Yeah.
So overall, did you enjoy your time on the GR3?
Yes, very much. It was a challenging aircraft to fly. It had some interesting characteristics in the V-STOL regime. That's hovering and slow speed. You had to be very much on top of the aircraft. You just had to be very careful with it, because the main dangerous characteristic of that aircraft was that it had a very weak auto-stabilization system. Now, when we got the GR5 and the GR7 and the 9 subsequently, they had very strong auto-stabilization systems. So that if you were, for instance, decelerating to the hover in the GR5 onwards, the aircraft would actually keep itself in balanced flight the whole time. Oh. GR3 wouldn't do that. It would, even though it had auto-stabilization, it was not powerful enough to do that. So it was reliant on the pilot to make sure he was always on top of what the aircraft was doing as you slowed down into the hover or accelerated away from the hover. And if you didn't keep on top of it, you could finish up in a situation where the aircraft would become directionally unstable. So it would try and weathercock away from the wind. And the problem with that, it was that it would then generate a lot of roll, which you couldn't control. So the aircraft would actually roll out of control. And by the time you'd realise it was going to roll out of control, you were probably too late to eject. And if you stayed in the aircraft, you're going to die anyway. So sadly, that did happen to the odd person in the early days. So we were well aware of the limitations of the aircraft, but you just had to be totally on top of what was going on. And so if you were going to decelerate to the hover, if you could, you would always tend to decelerate into wind, but of course you couldn't always do that. For instance, going into field sites in Germany, you had a lane to decelerate along, and there'd be other field sites out there, so you didn't use other people's lanes. You had a lane, and you had to decelerate. It didn't matter which way the wind was coming from, you had to decelerate down that lane. Now, having said that, in Germany, out in the field sites, generally low wind conditions, but not always. So it's things like that. So the aircraft was, yes, it could be very dangerous, but you just had to stay on top of it. So that was one side of it. The other thing was that you were short of fuel. You had a fairly unreliable navigational system as well. So you were always, from the time you got airborne, you were operating against reduced fuel load, always trying to make sure you knew where you were, despite what the inertial system might be telling you. You're trying to control if you're leading another aircraft or 4 aircraft or 5 aircraft or whatever. So it's a lot of workload for a single seat pilot, a lot going on. So it was always a challenge, and I think we all relished that as well. It was a very demanding aircraft to fly, but we loved flying it. There's no doubt about that.